this is my last little kick at the forestry carbon thing. As I said, we've gone from a carbon sink to a carbon source. If you look on the left, these 2015 emissions, you'd think they'd be more recent, but they are some of the most recent information that the government has published. So in 2015, there were 63 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions reported for all of BC. The unreported emissions, which I will leave you to your own conjecture about why they were unreported, from forestry, which includes planting, logging, hauling it to a mill, wood products manufacturing, were 67 million tons. If any of you want a link to it, I can give you a link to an excellent report that Jim Pojar, who's a retired forest ecologist in Smithers and an associate of many years, published as part of a meeting I went to in Victoria called the Forest Discussion. And he did an excellent job of explaining what's behind this diagram. Now, if you look at the projected emissions from 2017, you're going to have as much logging, but then you're also going to have wildfire. And the projection there that was made by the Sierra Club and supported by Jim in his analysis is it uses federal data instead of BC data. I'm not going to try to untangle why we don't know more about this, but it's not a good answer. You know, it's not a good answer that this stuff isn't readily public. The short thing to say is forestry is the biggest source of greenhouse gases in British Columbia, period. You know, so I'm glad that we're all really focused on cars and fossil fuels. It's a big part of the picture, no question about that. But the biggest culprit goes unnamed here. And that biggest culprit is responsible for a whopping 2.5% of the GDP of this province. And perhaps in rural communities, there's this huge pushback with caribou, with many other things to say, but what about the rural communities? What about the rural communities where it's a bigger percentage of what people do in a rural community? Good point, but instead of 2.5%, it generally is around 15% or maybe creeping up towards 20%, even in those communities. And any good economist worth their salt will tell you, you don't keep trying to build one-horse towns. You don't keep trying to have economies based on a single driver. You want diverse economies. So if we had, to me, socially responsible government, they would be working in a transition for that diversity, and they're not. So the other thing that climate change ties with climate change, it's something you can identify with. Inland temperate rainforests where we live here, these forests get, 30%, 40% less precipitation, even counting winter snow, than temperate rainforests do. Well, how have we built ecosystems that look just like a temperate rainforest on the coast? We built them with summer precipitation. I used to, for a while, hay fields. And anybody who hays around here knows that June used to be an absolutely horrible month to try to get hay up, because it always got wet, you know, and you had overnight recovery that spread dew on it, if nothing else. And so the high soil moisture, because of things like summer precipitation and the plentiful snowmelt that seeped down from the mountains through months and months that kept the valley bottoms wet, and high humidity throughout the year was what gave us these amazing ecosystems. But they are really threatened right now. They are really, you know, when I walk around in my very mixed forest, I communicate with those trees, and they're not telling me good things. I think they're a lot further towards an edge than we think. And so there's some urgency if we want to see these forests survive. Now a little politics. So let's keep in mind that 95% of the forests in British Columbia are public. The Forest Service is gone. Remember when you used to have a district ranger, or a district, you had a ranger district, then you had a forest district, and now we have resource districts. I'll leave that to when we talk about the politics of words. That's an interesting way to get people to see the world differently. Legislation, regulations, and policy defining standards are gone. The Forest Practices Code is an advisory thing if a timber company wants to use it, but it has no legal status. The public has no standards on which to rely. If you go talk to a forester working for a timber company, they now, in the absence of the Forest Service and with the adoption of professional reliance, all they have to do is tell you, it's my professional opinion that this works. There's no obligation to have a standard or to provide you with a standard. And because there's no obligation to provide you with a standard, there's no accountability. They basically cannot be held accountable. So accountability is gone. Access to meaningful information. I told you my story about the slide on the Little Slocan River. Well, boy, you can multiply that times everything. There's one, I'm always fascinated by what I just referred to as the politics of words. And we now, the only plan that exists for forests today that the public gets to see is called a forest stewardship plan. Wonderful words. Sounds like what we want, forest stewardship. The problem is it doesn't say anything. It's not a plan, it's a checklist. It doesn't say when people are going to log, where people are going to log, how they're going to log. There is some movement in the government right now to at least try to inject that into forest stewardship plans, but the industry is fighting back on that one. We also used to know what was going on through a series of well-constructed annual reports that were put out by the Forest Service. That's gone. You could know how much had been logged last year in a particular district and how it had been logged. So another way to get what you want if you're corporate interests is to not have an informed public. And so, hence, no reports. Forest research has been diminished to the point where it can't really effectively address the problems that need to be addressed. Intact natural forests are rapidly disappearing. I gave you an example of their importance. Old growth forests in particular are rapidly disappearing. And as we talked, forestry contributes significantly to climate change. We haven't had a forest inventory, or even to narrow it a little bit, a timber inventory in this province for more than 15 years. It used to be a legal requirement that there had to be a new forest inventory every 5 years. That was quietly, without any public consultation or anything, done away with by the previous Liberal government. We've had a study group to look at what should be in an inventory, but there's still no legal requirement to do that. As a result, the sustainable cutting rates that are used around this province are based on computer models. Well, you'll be interested to know that those, along with the forest inventories being out of date and computer modeling, that the assumptions are developed by the chief forester and her leadership council, which are all the chief foresters of the major timber companies. There's not an indigenous person there. There's not a person from a rural community. There's not an ecologist there. I mean, if we're talking about ecosystem services, you would think that would be a fairly important input to that. This is a really bad thing. I mean, if the government needs to wake up because all the Chief Forester's Office becomes under this situation is a lobbying agency for industry. You know, that's not either democracy, let alone good government of any sort. So we allegedly manage for all values, but if you're a caribou or a tourism operator or someone who gets their water directly from forests, you know that short-term timber trumps. And the sad part of this legacy is that we produce less jobs per tree cut or logging truckload of wood in this province than any of the other provinces. And we have by far the richest, biggest, best forests. So that's going somewhere. Certainly not to the benefit of communities and forests overall. And log exports have skyrocketed in the last 15 to 20 years. So there goes some more jobs out of the picture. So I told you a little bit about where we are today. We have a choice of what path we want to go down. One of the things that I see increasingly in all of these debates, and people readily admit that, is they're value-based. I mean, if I can tell you as a trained scientist that when I did research and somebody gave me a set of data or I collected it, when I made an interpretation from that data, that interpretation was seen through my values. It was seen through my how I saw the world. Objectivity and impartiality are illusions. They're convenient illusions that people like to train scientists in, and because it's a way of controlling you. It's a way of, and so industry and government can put out there, we need an independent person, and here's the person that's going to do it. Well, that person gets picked because of their values, not really because of their independent, but because of their values. I don't say that person's bad because of that. I mean, but one of the things that's important is that we can't have any value we want in society today and survive. When we had very small populations that weren't technologically equipped, that weren't driven to consumerism, then perhaps you could have some different values. But interestingly then, with indigenous cultures, they had a value that they had learned and accepted, and people were taught. It wasn't a matter of what value would you like. It was a matter of this is the value that you will live. And a lot of it had to do with survival. Well, we're right back to survival, in my opinion, right now, and we better quickly get the dominant value right, and we better quit saying to society, we're going to accommodate all these values. We need to pick that survival value, which is being a respectful part of systems, not trying to remake them. So that leads me to some wise words from more than one Indigenous elder that I've had the pleasure to work with. When we talk about ecosystems and their parts, that kind of dollar-laden word, resources, Indigenous culture, the values that we're talking about, see them as identities to be respected, not objects to be dominated. I hope I've translated that well from Inuamun and Niska and Gitxsan and Haida and many others where I've been told that. Those are my words, and I take credit for them, but I think that's what I was being taught. That's the kind of value we need to start with. And then when we start thinking about what to do in forests, we need to think about big forest landscapes, because big forest landscapes hold patches. And if you go back to the water drop, and what I said is there's no such thing as a small mistake, that means that because landscapes literally hold patches like the cup of my hand here, that if you do something in one part of the landscape, it's going to influence patches throughout that landscape, whether it's animal habitat, whether it's water, whether it's carbon, whether it's microclimate. And similarly, if you start perforating too many of the patches, then that degrades the whole landscape. So we have to operate from the big to the little and the little to the big to make it work. We need to focus on maintaining natural composition, structure, and function. Okay, 3 ecological terms. Structure or composition is just the parts. Trees, animals, lichens, small plants, big plants. Structure is how they're arranged. Big trees, little trees. Structure also talks about patterns, if you think about a landscape. Old growth, young forests, riparian or wet ecosystems along streams and rivers. So, and function is how composition and structure work together to develop the processes that we've been talking about tonight, to develop the process of water quality, quantity, and timing of flow, to manage that, to develop the process of carbon sequestration and storage, to develop the myriad of habitats needed for biological diversity that supports that whole system. So there's a really interesting formula to remember, simple one. Composition plus structure equals function. So if you lose the composition or the structure or you change it, then you change the function. And so that's when you're walking around out there thinking about forests and thinking about maybe even sometimes why you don't like how you feel where you are, think about that formula. Composition plus structure equals function. And I'll bet you where you feel uncomfortable, you're going to find out that either the structure or the composition has been altered in some way. And that's altered the functions and how you feel about it. Then the big thing for us, a very short-lived species, is we have to maintain that through time. So, the older I get, the more I like this. And it goes without saying that old is better. Old and big is even better. See, I told you, it fits. Old, big, and complex. Well, we hope there's still some complexity there. Is what we're looking for. And in that regard, let's put to rest this debate about old growth forests. They are non-renewable, and I'll add the word resources because our capitalistic society loves to stick that word in there. We don't know how to create an old growth forest. If we're lucky, and the trees we plant or naturally regenerate will grow into old trees. Climate change threatens that now, but there is absolutely no evidence that they will develop the biological diversity and the complex composition and structure of natural old growth forests. We haven't even identified that. So how can we say that? I mean, people have gone back in the eastern part of the U.S. and looked at some of the early colonial clearings and things that weren't done by indigenous people, but done by colonists that came from Europe and cleared land. And then the land went fallow. So we're talking 200 years plus, at least in many of those places. And they've asked the question, did it return to the composition and structure that you would have expected in those forests? And the answer was no. Probably we lose soil microorganisms that are responsible for maintaining a lot of that above ground diversity. There's some evidence of that, but we don't totally know that. And that brings me to the importance of decayed wood. Well, decayed wood are where a lot of those soil fungi live. It's literally the foundation for future forests. It it holds about 20 times as much water in it for a given volume as most mineral soils do, than sandy loam soils. Before climate change, I have done many walks through forests with young people and older people and talked about this, and I could depend on, even in September or August, finding a decayed tree laying on the ground, and I could stick my hand inside of it, and I could pull it out, and I could squeeze water out of it, always. That's changed, you know. It's still wet and it's still moist, but boy, is there a noticeable lack of moisture. The other thing that I got when I stuck my hand into that and pulled it out was fungal felts, mycorrhizal fungi, which now have become really popular if you're a gardener to plant when you plant trees and things like that. Well, same, they're different species, but in the fungi, or mushrooms as a fruiting body, but fungus and plural fungi, are literally make the forest into a single organism, because their roots, or hyphae, are so fine that you can put them 3 or 4 kilometers of them in a gram of forest soil that I can hold in the palm of my hand. So they wrap around the roots of all the other plants. They're actually how plants get water and nutrients. They're much more effective than root hairs or big blunt roots. They can grab that, they pass it through a root graft to the tree or the shrub or the moss, which in turn has done photosynthesis and says, thank you for the water and nutrients, here's some sugars and carbohydrates. So it works both ways. So that decayed wood is the carryover mechanism for those organisms. We talked about that. They're keystone species, those fungi. They make the system work. I've yet to see in 40 plus years of doing it any forestry plan or logging plan that took into account the fungi. I'm still looking, still reminding people about that, but we still haven't seen that. Okay, I want to talk a little bit now about a different kind of relationship with forests. This is a value system that I think is kind of at the root of what we need to do. We call it ecosystem-based conservation planning. I told you the kind of humorous development of that, but it's best characterized by this hierarchy. Economies are part of human cultures, and human cultures are part of ecosystems. So if you play that back in reverse, if you take care of ecosystems, you always have healthy cultures. And if you have healthy cultures, you always have healthy economies. Because all an economy is people relating to people, providing the goods and services that we need, with an underscore under need. Even neoclassical economists will agree with that definition. They will also agree with the fact that the only economies through time that have ever been sustainable are community-based economies or tribal-based economies, literally. Any economist worth their salt is not going to try to tell you that the global economy is sustainable. And yet, I mean, the global economy survives by degrading local ecosystems and local communities to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. So that's not long-lasting. That's not enduring. It will come to an end at some point. So these ideas of three-legged stools, as though society, environment, economy are all equal, assumption of convenience. A good way to convince all of us that we need to make sure that large capitalistic interests have their share and then some. And so that hierarchy, if you want to talk about truths, and if you define truth as an essential reality, which is a good way to do it, I think, that's an essential reality. Another thing that's in that diagram to point out is, notice about half of the green space doesn't have cultures and economies in it. That's an intentional part of that diagram because we need to have at least 50% of this planet that we don't mess around with. And you know, that's been something that a value that was taught by myriads of indigenous cultures for millennia. Now we have conservation biology pointing that out over and over again in science and saying that we've got to get back to that if we're going to deal with climate change. So we implement this system also by starting with focus on what to protect, then on what to use. What to protect are fully functioning ecosystems that we've been talking about, from the scale of this darning needle on a bluebell to whole landscapes. We build plans that people live through, 200, 500 years and beyond. That's putting the ecosystem first, not short-term human wants. So plans that are full cycle plans for salmon, for trees, for water, and the late Stan Rowe, who was a mentor to me for many years and on our board, always reminded me that don't forget the rocks and the minerals, the time frame there, which is a really long time frame. But that's how, not only are those precautionary ways of relating to Earth, they're humble ways of relating to Earth. And that gives us space to make mistakes. And it gives us a way of thinking that really is intergenerational, not just about today. So there's two priorities. The first priority is to protect or restore ecological integrity. What's ecological integrity? Well, think about those words: composition, structure, and function. Natural composition, structure, and function, from those little patches to those big landscapes. And natural means pre-industrial activities, but includes indigenous management systems, which were by and large very much a part of natural systems. And the second priority is to provide for balanced human and non-human, both human and non-human uses across the landscape. Balance is a really important thing. And you know, it really frustrates me how little that has changed in my working lifetime. We still have something way out of balance when it comes to forest ecosystems. One of the ways we also do this is to practically apply the precautionary principle through things we call ecological limits. These are things that are easily damaged by us intruding. They're de facto part of that green that human beings don't mess around in. And some examples are shallow soils, very dry or very wet sites. Dry and wet have different reactions, but they're both very sensitive. Steep and broken, things that go like this, like a sawtooth. They could be flat in their main, but if they're broken like that, they are very easy to damage. High elevation or snow-dominated ecosystems where climate controls what happens in those systems. They're becoming rarer with climate change. Unique and rare habitat. Even in natural intact systems, there are certain kinds of ecosystem associations that are rare. Most of them are occupied by plant species, often tree species that aren't found commonly throughout the area. Those have a particular habitat niche for a whole group of animals. If you take them out, they're not much of the mass of that landscape, but your heart isn't much of the mass of your body either. But if you take your heart out, you don't work very well. And so that's why they're ecological limits, and they're tied, the rare habitats are tied to that. Threatened and endangered species are really another way of talking about unique and rare habitat in the form of the organisms that need that habitat. Riparian ecosystems, wet forests, they're very sensitive places too. And they're a place that we need to make sure are maintained with natural composition and structure. Old natural forests. You know, I didn't say old growth there on purpose because we have basically done in old growth. But we do have some patches, some landscapes that have a fair amount of old natural intact forests. They need to be seen as an ecological limit. And increasingly, natural intact ecosystems, period. These last two are really additions through the years as we watched natural forests or natural ecosystems in general disappear. So how do we do this? Well, we do this through networks of ecological reserves, which means networks of ecological protected areas and cultural reserves. We have worked with a lot of indigenous people, and we use the ecological data, their observation-based knowledge, their indigenous knowledge, to design networks that protect their culture. There's a huge correlation in those designs between networks of ecological reserves and cultural reserves, as you might guess. And you have to do that at multiple spatial scales, from these big landscapes down to patches. Let's look quickly at what that looks like when you look at a big landscape. This is in Nitassinan, or what we know as Labrador. The Innu word for that, or for our land, is Nitassinan. That's, that forest management district was kind of an arbitrary boundary, and I won't bore you with the story of why that happened. But that was about, in this particular area, about 7.3, 7.4 million hectares. So the first thing that we did was design these big areas, which are multi-watershed level reserves. This blue area is a red wine caribou habitat, which was a very important, not only ecologically, but culturally to the Innu. And so now we focused on the center piece here, which is where some timber companies wanted to log in Innu territory. And we fine-tuned, we added some additional, like the yellow areas are conservation emphasis, so they have some activities that can occur in them, but we also added some new protected areas as it's kind of like a camera with a zoom lens. As you learn more and more about it, you can design it more carefully. And unfortunately, these really don't cut it with this light. Normally, you could see a lot of little red patches in that at the watershed level for Cape Caribou there. They're all ecologically limited forested bogs to one degree or another. People wanted to log them because they had merchantable trees, but if you took the trees away, you ended up with ponds, not forests. And then finally, what we call the Innu forestry block. In that little block, you could see that there were small patches of trees that were removed, individual trees that were removed, some additional riparian protection. I worked with both Innu elders and the forest crew. We developed this little system that we called micro bogs, where they could map where these bogs were in the forest, and we built buffers around them to protect them culturally and ecologically. So that's what multiple spatial scale design looks like. It's a Shawnigan Lake plan that is just north of Victoria, which is an interesting watershed. And what we were asked to do was to focus on the restoration and protection of water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. And we developed a network around that. It shows you the elements here of a place where forestry was cutting some trees was determined to be okay. And I can explain some of the elements here because you can see them. This is a riparian reserve where along a stream. Another little riparian reserve, another one here. These green areas, if you look carefully there, you can see how in the photograph the crowns of the trees look kind of ragged. It doesn't look smooth and even. Those were areas that we looked at on the ground and then used that to learn about when we interpreted the photos that show a lot of diversity. And so they have become biodiversity nodes. Then these are linkages to connect the biodiversity nodes. The red ones are shallow to bedrock ecologically sensitive sites. Here's a small forested wetland. Now, all those green dots there represent leaving 25 to 30% of the largest trees on the site. So when you're done, you not only have still a forest there in the sense of standing trees everywhere, but you have this network within which it's nested. So that's what ecologically responsible activities in forests, to me, look like. So we can do this. Forestry is not a science. Forestry is a practice. Medicine is a practice, not a science. And when we've learned about things in medicine through science that hurt us, we changed them, didn't we? We went, no, that's not a good idea to do that anymore. So we can do the same thing. And the definition of how it's done is an industrial definition, not a societal definition, not an ecological definition. And it's just riddled with those things that I talk about as assumptions of convenience. It's so riddled that people that graduate with forestry degrees like I did get taught those things as though they were written on a golden tablet found under a tree, you know, and it's there that we can do something different. How do we redefine it? Well, the size of the font there tells you. Right now, the biggest thing we've got to think about is climate change and how we deal with that. Right, coupled with that at the same level are water and biological diversity. If we don't protect water and protect biological diversity, we'll not protect that composition and structure I've been talking about. Then we can start thinking about employment and socially responsible economics. You know what? Both of these things will come very naturally by doing this. It will not be a problem. I've done a lot of thinking and designing and implementing that. I'll show you one example here in a minute. It's not hard. So there's what E.O. Wilson, who is the father of conservation biology, has to say about it, that we've got to set aside half of it to achieve the stabilization that we need for survival. So my point to foresters is let's get on with it. If the forestry profession was a profession instead of towing the line to timber companies, they would be speaking out about this. That there is a need for professionals, not just in forestry, but particularly in forestry, to make these things known.